各位女士各位先生，欢迎大家来参加我们罗家伦国际汉学讲座的系列演讲的活动。那我们今天非常荣幸请到英国剑桥大学东亚学系教授，也是英国国家学术院院士的胡司德教授来这里进行一个系列的演讲。那今天这个系列的演讲事实上包含4个部分哦。那整个系列的演讲的一个主题是早期中国的自然世界哦，那文化跟政治的生态。那这个胡司德教授在这个演讲系列里面将探讨将今天的这个部分探讨这个龙何以幻化这个中国古代的这个非人动物，然后在星期五有中国古代思想的自然环境，下个星期三会谈这个土壤的驯化，中国古代农学跟农民然后我们在下星期五还有个工作坊。谈猪只与人体，中国古代肥料简史。那胡教授这一个演讲系列是在我们文学院的这个国际汉学专班的这一个课程里面，就是关于这个自然史与医疗史新视野的这个课程里面的一个部分。那这个部分是这个课程是由这个陈秀芬老师所主持的，所以我们今天也请他来当这个主持人，来跟大家介绍胡教授以及这个整个演讲系列的一个主要的要研究这个对象。好，那我们请那个陈老师。
好，胡司德教授、林主任，在场的老师、学生，还有线上的朋友，因为我们这个场次好像有 YouTube 直播这样。我是国立政治大学历史系的陈秀芬，我非常荣幸的邀请英国剑桥大学亚洲与中东研究学院吴思德教授立校演讲然后这个是罗家伦的汉学讲座。罗家伦先生呢是政大在那个大陆前身的学校曾经担任那个教务长是民国初年的非常有名的政治家跟学者。然后他的家属就是对政大有一个非常慷慨的捐赠，所以我们才成立这个汉学讲座。那我们过去几年邀请了世界非常多知名的学者立校来那个指导。上个月我们还有那个哈佛大学的那个 much-acclaimed 欧立德教授刚来过这样。那胡司德教授他的名字我刚才还请教，因为虽然我们认识20几年，我还不会念他的名字他说他的名字叫发音是那个 Roel Sterckx，他是那个 Flemish就那个比利时法兰德斯的人。他从比利时荷语区鲁文大学取得硕士学位之后呢，然后在英国的剑桥大学就是完成他的博士学位。那他的业师如果我没记错的话应该是 much-acclaimed 教授，也是中国古代史研究的名家。那胡教授在剑桥取得学位之后呢，他曾经在美国的亚利桑那大学任教短暂的时间，后来回到剑桥然后执掌那个汉学系的那个就是教职。那他有曾经2度担任东亚系的主任，那他一直是那个 Clare College 的那个就是研究员然后他同时也积极的参与那个里约社研究所的那个 trustee 的工作这样。那2013年胡教授他荣获英国学术界最高的荣誉英国国家学术院的院士英文是Fellow of the British Academy 是简称 FBA， 这个是在英国在等同于那个中央研究院的院士的位置。那他的研究主要是先秦跟秦汉初期的中国思想与文化史，包括古典与文言文、语文及语言学的研究。那他的著作非常惊人数量好多，而且有好几本书都已经翻译成英语之外的其他的语言，然后中译本也非常的多。 那我个人非常欣赏的呢，是他研究的视野非常的开阔。他虽然做的是中国古代史，可是他总是能够从那些古典的文献出发，然后在科学史跟人类学的视野之下呢，去体验出一些有趣的议题。那他持续关注中国古代社会中有关自然世界的各种知识的形态，包括文化生态、农业、自然历史和动物研究等领域。那胡教授他也曾经就是探讨饮食文化、礼仪和宗教以及经济思想。他特别感兴趣的呢，根据他自己的说法呢，是中国思想中道德价值和物质价值之间的互动，以及这种互动关系呢，在战国和汉代社会如何被展现。那他涉猎过的议题很宽泛呢，包括礼仪的经济学、礼物的文化、对财富还有贫穷的认知、劳动和各行各业的角色连我这个其实我是做明清的，那我认识他很多年，我都还陆续从他的研究里面得到一些启发。这样，那胡司德教授他本次的讲座，刚才林主任已经做了介绍。这样他今天的讲题就是说谈那个龙何以幻化嘛其实涉及到动物研究。那动物研究在这几年国内外都非常的热门，而且有非常多不少就是说跨学科的讨论。就我所知，我们国家图书馆在那个5月呢，就会有一个很大型的那个国际研讨会。我相信以胡教授的博学强记呢，必然会为我们带来一场那个知识的飨宴。请用最热烈的掌声欢迎胡司德教授帮我们做演讲。
尊敬的来宾、同事们、同学们，我非常高兴和荣幸被邀请在国立政治大学发表这个罗家伦讲座。1990年夏天，那一年我代表我的祖国比利时参加了一个由正大举国际青年中国研究研讨会。这是我第一次访问台湾。我还清晰的记得有一天，我们在上课的时候，突然有一个轻微的地震，我们的那个茶杯都开始晃动，所以这一定是一个积极的预兆。激起我对那个台北的感情。那几年后，我回到台北，在国立台湾大学哲学系当研究生。又15年后，我再一次回到中央研究院，当然访问学者。近年来旅行变得更加困难，所以我特别高兴能再一次来到这里。我很荣幸被邀请为那个罗家伦这位受人尊敬的学者、知识分子和大学管理人员发表演讲，所以我衷心感谢林元泽教授和陈淑芬教授的热情邀请，以及办公室里的人做出一切实际的安排，所以非常感谢。好。Why do dragons change? The non-human animal in early China. Now you all know that throughout Chinese history, no creature has inspired as much imagination, not just amongst the Chinese people and their observers, than the dragon. Dragon imagery, myths and stories surrounding dragons, and representations of dragons have graced editions. Okay, can you hear me now? Good, okay. So, representations of dragons, it can be found, of course, in classical Chinese texts, in Chinese art, in architecture for centuries. It's the dragon, in a way, and dragonesque imagery have stood for almost as a metaphor, right, for Chinese civilization. It has symbolized China's moral values, its products, as well as sustained perceived cultural stereotypes associated, with China. I'm going to show you a couple of slides. I did a quick stroll, through a bibliography, just looking at some titles, some texts, of course, that deal with China in the English language, that have the word dragon in their title, right? And there are many of them, of course. Dragons waking, right? Dragon ropes, the dragon's teeth, the last empress, the she-dragon of China, the digital dragon, high technology dragon. So just a quick browse through the number of titles, that obviously contain the word dragon, just tells you the story. Now, despite the popularity, of course, of the image of the dragon, we don't quite know, obviously, where the origins of the dragon as an animal can be situated to. Zoo historians have speculated for a long time on the amphibian or the reptilian origins, of a creature identifiable as a dragon. But it's fair to say that, of course, the common dragon was not a pet, in ancient China. It was an imagined creature, right? It was a hybrid. It was a hybrid of which most traditional descriptions emphasize that the dragon incorporates the bodily parts of all animal species in one, right? The dragon swims, the dragon flies, the dragon has claws and scales, the dragon can hibernate or manifest itself during any season, and so on. So the dragon is the ultimate, I call it shape shifter. It shifts its shape. It's a creature that is subject to perpetual metamorphosis, sort of bian and hua, if you like. It's a creature that in many ways escapes any fixed biological definition. And in that way, I think the dragon is a perfect metaphor for the way in which the ancient Chinese tried to identify and classify the animal world. For if the ancient Greeks were preoccupied with the search for biological, or if you like, ontological fixity in their analysis of the animal world, the early Chinese insisted that both the physical and the moral boundaries between living species, including 人类, including human beings, that those boundaries were subject to change and transformation. Now, I'm first going to turn to a quote from a piece of 20th century fiction, and then I'm going to pause briefly with two 19th century sinologists, 汉学家, and then I'm going to make a leap back in time of 2,000 years to warring states and early imperial China, right? So the period that all of you are familiar with, it's a formative period in the history of Chinese thought, spanning roughly from the late 5th to the 1st centuries BCE. And that's where I hope to stay for the rest of this lecture. Now, in his much-acclaimed novel, La Tentation de l'Occident, or the Temptation, of the West, the French writer, at the age of 25 when he was writing, André Malraux, he stages a fictitious correspondence between a young Frenchman who was traveling through China in the 1920s and his young Chinese friend who is visiting Europe at the same time. So one is in China and one is in Europe. And they communicate, they write letters to each other. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Now, in one of the letters between the two protagonists, the Chinese correspondent, who's known as Ling, instructs his European counterpart on some of the underlying principles of Chinese art and aesthetics. And commenting on the relationship between a painter and a cat, he writes the following, and you have the quote here in Chinese translation on the slide. So the interlocutor writes, "The idea of species for you is quite abstract. It allows you to classify. It's a means towards knowledge. In us, it is closely connected with our sensibility. When I say cat, what dominates my mind is not a picture of a cat, but an impression of certain simple, silent movements peculiar to cats. You distinguish among species only by their outlines." And of course, by you, this is the Chinese correspondent, obviously instructing his Western counterpart. But such distinction only applies in death. The notion of species, for us, can no more be exactly defined than style. The sense of species can only be suggested. So what is Malraux's Chinese protagonist suggesting here? He's suggesting that the Western mind is first and foremost concerned with obtaining and representing knowledge through the classification and the differentiation of species. In other words, the Western mind seeks clarity regarding the outlines, the contours of the cat. The Chinese observer, on the contrary, is said to be interested in representing movement and change, describing the movements of the cat rather than trying to achieve a formal picture of a perfect cat. The Chinese artist aligns himself or herself with the natural image to be represented rather than turning it into an object detached from the subjectivity of the observer. This way toward knowledge is not one of classification. Rather, it entails a careful display of an innate empathy, a sensibility with the object that is being represented. So in short, in the eyes of Malraux, or in the eyes of Malraux's Chinese correspondent, subject and object merge, the painter and the cat become one. Now this example is of course fictitious, right? It's simply coming out of Malraux's, I suppose, 想象, right? His imaginative quest for, back then, he was still, trying to look for something called the Oriental mind. Now, these days, of course, we no longer use, or we're no longer supposed to use, the word Oriental, but it's fictitious, but in a way, it contains a relevance for students of early China, because the presumption that the natural world can be described as an independent universe, an independent world that functions according to its own biological mechanics, or if you want to continue the analogy, that the cat can be represented independently from the painter, right? This can be said to be one of the major temptations, of course, of the West, to paraphrase Malraux. So the acceptance that the natural world can and ought to be differentiated into essential or sort of ontological categories in order to make it comprehensible, as the Greeks insisted, is another version of the same temptation. But ever since the dawn of their discipline, scholars of Chinese thought and historians of science have been puzzled and in some cases frustrated by the relationship between the painter and the cat in early China. Now let's look at a few examples of this. Here we have 19th century Dutch sinologist Jan Jacob Maria de Groot, who wrote, this big series, The Religious System of China, multi-volume, almost, observatory anthropological analysis of Chinese religion. Now, he at one point states, and I quote him, here you have the translation in Chinese here, he says, the Chinese authors have roundly avowed themselves altogether unable to discover any real difference between men and animals. Now, de Groot's not the only one. Look, here we have Marcel Granet, of course, the great synthesizing genius of French sinology in his La Pensée, chinoise, 中国思想, he says something similar. He says the Chinese have no taste at all for classification into genres or species. And then let's move up the timeline, and here we have Li Yue, Joseph Needham. And now, interestingly, perhaps one of the most contemporary examples of our continuing sort of difficulty to explain the perception of animals in the Chinese context is the absence of a volume in Joseph Needham's monumental, Science and Civilization series in China, right? His 中国科技基础史. There is no volume on zoology in there. Now, I do know from the archives that we have in Cambridge at the Needham Institute that Needham was actively collecting materials. He wanted to write this volume on zoology, but he never completed it. And he didn't have enough information gathered either to complete it. So he was brilliant in dealing with topics like botany, alchemy, mining, shipbuilding, but somehow appeared to be at a loss when it came to describing a history of the living species in pre-modern China. There was a Chinese volume, 中国古代动物学史, which was put together by Chinese scholars in honor of Joseph Needham, but that is not a book that was conceived by Needham, and essentially it is, it's an homage, but not quite a substitute, for any absence of a volume on zoology in the original series. Now, why has it been proven more easy for scholars to write about the human sages of ancient China rather than lecture about its birds and beasts? So let's go back now 2 millennia to early China and sample a rare epistemological statement on the relationship between a human observer and the animal world. Here it is for you. The statement occurs in a hand text known as the 春秋繁录, right? And it is attributed, to Dong Zhongshu, right, who was active during the 2nd century BCE. And look what he says here: 能说鸟兽之类者，非圣人所欲说也。Right? 圣人所欲说，在于说仁义而理之. Right? So basically, the sage, or being able to explain the species of birds and beasts, is not something which the Shengren wants to do. The Shengren wants to explain benevolence and righteousness and regulate those. Now, at first reading, this remark and the philosophical climate out of which it grew seems to suggest that the animal world was a topic not worthy of intellectual scrutiny in ancient China. In fact, there is one apocryphal anecdote that actually tells that Dong Zhongshu was so serious about his study that he refused, to look through the window and watch the parks, and watch the natural environment around him. And that when he was riding a horse, he was unable to tell whether he was riding a mare or a stallion. It's, however, equally clear from the rest of Dong Zhongshu's work, or at least the text linked to him, and also from a host of other contemporary texts, that the early Chinese was certainly interested in naming and classifying animals. So what do we make of the Chinese sages' alleged refusal to differentiate 鸟兽之类? Why does a philosopher in the 2nd century BCE not think much of being able to distinguish stallions from mares. Now, in effect, what really draws Malraux, De Groot, Granet, and Tung Zhongshu together here is that each of them, in their own way, reminds us that animal classification, like the concept of nature itself, are partly to be perceived as cultural constructs. They also remind us that perceptions of species boundaries are historically contingent and predicated by, of course, a cultural and a social historical context. Right? So Aristotle may have looked like an amateur to Linnaeus, right, the Swedish biologist, who no doubt, of course, looks like an outlier to modern-day animal geneticists. And finally, these voices insinuate that while the modern Western mind may even be impelled or encouraged to view animals as subjects or objects belonging to a natural world detached from human concerns, such naturalist perception of the animal world is not universal and applicable across cultures. Indeed, the classic Chinese perception of the world did not insist on clear categorical boundaries between animals, human beings, and other creatures, such as the Gui and the Shen, right, the ghosts and the spirits. And the demarcation of the human and the animal realm was not perceived to be permanent, to be constant, or to be predetermined even by a divine order, right, or by some sort of creation, right, so the Genesis story. Indeed, as we will see, the motives behind classification and the creation of animal names, or nomenclature, right, giving names to creatures, in ancient China, the motivations were not those of the zoologist. Now, one area that illustrates the low share of zoological theory in China is that of basic terminology used to refer to animals both as a generic category or a collective of different species groups. The classical Chinese language lacks a linguistic equivalent for the term animal, which of course has its origins in the Platonic notion of zoon and presupposes animacy and inanimacy as distinctive criteria. Now, as a concept including everything which partakes of life, including humans and animals, as opposed to mineral life or plant life, the term animal may not be entirely compatible with classical Chinese equivalents, right, such as wu, right, or shou, or qin, right, birds, wild birds, beasts, or chong, invertebrates, but insects, but also a general terminology for animals, or even the modern generic term for animals, dung wu, which basically means a moving being. Now, the word dung wu appears once in ancient China in the Zhou Li, right, the rites of Zhou, and there it literally means a thing that moves, right, but it is not a generic term, for an animal. Now, generic definitions of animals, including the human animal, are rare. I'm giving you an example here from the Liezi, which is a relatively late text, but it defines human beings as, what you have there is anything with a skeleton 7 feet high, hands different from its feet, hair on its head, and teeth inside the mouth, standing upward, as it runs, right? Birds and beasts are described as anything with wings at its side and horns on its head, teeth apart and claws spread out, flying upwards and walking bent down. Now, yet it's far more common to find the human-animal difference described in terms of moral characteristics and or sort of cognitive properties. We're running out of juice here. There we go. So it's much more common to find human-animal difference expressed in terms of moral characteristics, right, or cognitive properties. And the example there is from the Xunzi, right? 人之所以为人者何也？曰一气有变也, right? So what makes human beings human is not primarily because, a human being is a hairless biped, but because he has the ability to draw moral boundaries. This is sort of in that Xunzi notion of bian. Now, to be sure, this relative absence of zoological analysis did not imply any absence of a desire to classify the animal world. Despite a hesitance to theorize about biological cognition, the ancient Chinese, like their Greek counterparts, were preoccupied with ordering the world. Although, of course, they were not doing it in Aristotelian or Linnaean terms. Now, to understand the ways in which the Chinese classified, or what we say taxonomized, the fauna that surrounded them, we need to identify culturally specific factors that influenced their construction of biological reality. The motives underlying the identification and classification of animals in China were not primarily zoological, but they figured within a larger project to explain the structures of the cosmos as a whole. So rather than perceiving the world as purely a physical reality that can be analyzed as a sort of a biological system, the ancient Chinese classified the living species as part of a textual and a ritual order that was based on correlation rather than differentiation. Animal classification was subsumed, was part of a larger quest, of a larger search to establish a progressive socio-political, ritual, and intellectual control over the world at large. Ancient Chinese animal taxonomy amounted to what I would call a zoography. That means the belief that through a progressive description of all phenomena in the world, you can establish social and political control over these phenomena, and you can influence their inner and their outer workings. Now, this desire to design classificatory systems that aspired to increasing completeness or inclusivity emerged with greater prominence as China evolved, from a feudal state into a unified empire. Animal classification was part of the project of empire building. Its typologies were inspired by imperatives which served the meaning, or the making rather, of empire. The need to represent the whole world in text, to control its workings through ritual, and to reinforce its internal cohesion through the development of correlative schemes. Now, for the anthropologists and the historians of science among you, let me say a word here about the disciplinary status, or rather the lack thereof, that the study of animals in China has generated in the scholarly world, before I turn to some Chinese examples. Because, of course, the idea that classifying or that taxonomization implies inscribing animals within a textual and ritual order does not answer traditional expectations of either the naturalist or the scientist, nor does it comply with the assumptions of the folklorist or the ethnozoologist. Central to the intellectual quest of the naturalist, both in ancient subsistence societies and modern, if you like, industrial societies, central to the quest of the naturalist is a desire to classify animals first and foremost as biological creatures, with the purpose of explaining the internal physiological and behavioral workings of the animal world. So the ethnobiologist, on the other hand, attempts to clarify animals as creatures that operate in a symbolical realm. Right? And he seeks to cast extra biological links between the operation of the animal world and its classification by humans. Now, one way in which the distinction between these two methods and its classification, these two methods of classification has been presented, of course, is to identify the former as quote-unquote science, whereas labeling the latter as quote-unquote folk biology. Now, ethnobiologists are generally hesitant to present folk biology as some form of intuitive, right, or even naive form of scientific biology. They recognize the conceptual contingency between both classificatory systems. Now, historians of science, on the other hand, tend to be more linear-minded. Nevertheless, the relationship between folk biology and scientific taxonomy is occasionally still explained in terms of a hierarchy of values, in which folk models represent a historically and conceptually undeveloped or antecedent stage prior to scientific classification. In the case of ancient China, such perceptions have been reinforced by the absence of zoological treatises, texts, that deal, with animals. And also by a historian's desire by historians of science to reconstruct scientific data or taxa where none really were intended. And I'll give you the example again here of Joseph Needham. Joseph Needham at one moment is discussing the Kao Gongji. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Kao Gongji, which is a chapter in the Zhou, which is a separate text, which was added later to it. Now, in the Kao Gongji, there is a grouping of amphibians and reptiles together with invertebrates, and Needham calls this an unfortunate mistake. Now, Scott Atran, based on his reading of Needham's work, comments on the relative share of scientific versus folk classification of animals and plants in China. That's quite an interesting quote, right? He says, there is no herbal, in other words, a book that deals with botany. There is no herbal or encyclopedia that organizes more than 1,000 or so basic kinds of plants. Roughly the same number found in all folk biologies, and also in the works of ancient and medieval Europe, the Middle East and Mesoamerica. The Chinese Empire, it is true, encompassed many different subcultures whose respective folk taxonomies collectively sum to thousands of species. Yet, there is no evidence of any systematic attempt at a taxonomic organization of morphological information beyond that already present in ancient folk taxonomy. In other words, say, well, if historians of science are looking for science, just give up. It's not there. Whatever, however you want to define, of course, science. But in this analysis, folk biology provides a kind of an intuitive framework, right? An intuitive framework of common sense data based on which the scientific taxonomy may or may not, in the case of China, seek to then develop or extrapolate universals across culturally specific categories, right? The epistemological claim of lay taxonomy, Atran points out, differs from that of scientific taxonomy. Both provide a classification that is a key to nature, but they have different presumptions about what that nature is. For folk, nature can never be completely hidden, the presumption being that at least some of the typical features of a kind are necessary rather than incidental to its real nature, unquote. So as such, folk biology's influence on a so-called scientific discourse of animals includes what Atran calls basic common sense disposition to apprehend and order discontinuity in the living world, unquote. Now, I don't have a desire or do not wish to challenge the theoretical analysis of the sort of split or the bifurcation between folk and scientific taxonomy described here, but I remain unconvinced of its claim to universality across cultures. Inferring a distinction between a so-called scientific taxonomy, as opposed to a folk taxonomy, appears to me as a hermeneutic process that is only fruitful depending on the degree in which a society developed both systems of classification roughly at the same time. Now, do Chinese data on animals provide sufficient ground to infer the coexistence of a folk or proto-scientific discourse? Based on the current transmitted sources, I suggest that they may not. Given the internal structure of the text available for the study of animals in early China, as well as the provenance of its main representative text, it is problematic to uphold a conscious distinction between a universalist or technical treatment of animals as opposed to folk, which you could read as particular or non-technical or instinctive or symbolic, if you like. So our understanding of Chinese animal classification ought not to be guided by the question whether Chinese classification is internally consistent, appeals to biological universals, or has an exclusive or inclusive character. Instead, central to the understanding of the identification and classification of animals in early China ought to be the question whether it was the comprehension, the understanding of biological morphology that provided the primary motivation for classification. The scientific or symbolic analysis of animals should not be ranked in sequence, with the latter representing a so-called more primitive stage conditioning the discovery of the former. Attempts at classifying the living species in early China suggest that, first, symbolic classifications and biology do not preclude each other, and second, neither wholly requires the presence of the other to form a system that lends itself to a meaningful analysis of the natural world. So how then did the early Chinese name and classify animals? As I indicated already, animal classification operates within a larger project of classifying the cosmos as a whole in early China. So no strict dichotomy was conceived between the human and non-human world. The impulse to carve up the world into an order consisting of animate versus inanimate creatures was basically relegated in favor of the exercise of correlating all existing phenomena according to criteria that transcended speciesism or biological particularity. I suppose if we are looking for a common term to refer to, living creatures by the 4th century BC, roughly, you'd look for a term like 血气. It's down. I'm apologizing. It's down at the bottom here. 血气, right? So there are texts that tell us that the difference between animals and human beings depend on the degree of coarseness or refinement of your 血气, right? So everybody is a blood and qi creature, and it just depends, how distilled, this 血 and qi is. So that's a general generic. But basically, instead of going into the morphology of animals, we see different classificatory systems, and I've identified 4 here, and we'll go through each of these 4 to give you a flavor, of how I believe it works. The first is classifying the animal world through graphs, through characters, through Chinese characters, through lexicography. The second is classifying the animal world by means of ritual criteria. The third is correlative classification, which will be familiar to you. And then finally is a classification of living creatures through moral criteria. Now let's start here with classifying animals through graphs, right? Through characters. Now you all have been forced, during your training, in certainly in Chinese, to consult, Xu Shen Shuo Wen Jie Zi at some point, right? China's oldest, quote-unquote, lexicographical, text. It's very frequently quoted as evidence for the existence of a proto-zoological tradition in China. As a matter of fact, you look up animal names, this is going to be the first source that people refer to. Most encyclopedia will refer to the Shuo Wen Jie Zi as a first port of call. It's a book, a text concerned with lexicography, and of course it's by no means limited to terminology pertaining to the natural world. But the animal entries in the Shuo Wen Jie Zi illustrate a central feature associated with the identification of animals in early China, namely the belief that natural phenomena can be classified by analyzing and ordering the written graphs that represent them. So in other words, by explaining the zi, by explaining the graph, I also explain the creature that the graph represents, which is of course different than explaining the morphology and the behavior of an animal. So to the Chinese author or the people behind this text, animal classification is situated here at the intersection between natural observation and a graphic representation. And unraveling the texture, literally, of the natural world implies explaining the origins and compositions of the graphs used to represent it. And, underlying this whole organic view of etymology, right, of Xungu, right, is the idea that the character graphs themselves are organic. In other words, they're not simply representational, right? The animate nature of the written graph in early China was further reinforced by, of course, the mythology that characters or could be traced back, to Changjie's observation of animal footprints, that is animate rather than inanimate patterns. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the story, right? Changjie, with his four eyes, was watching, looked up in the heavens at one point, then stared down and he saw these footprints of birds, on the sand, and he used the footprints in order to derive, the trigrams that later become the hexagrams, and that becomes the origin of the Chinese script. So, but it's interesting, right? Because it actually places the Chinese character script as an organic part, of nature. You see, and then if you comprehend the characters, if you represent the characters, then you're actually doing simply more than communicating, in terms of a code. You're actually representing the thing, the biological creature behind it. But let's go back to this slide here. So we notice that scholars in early China appear to have been primarily concerned with the explanation of animal names rather than animals themselves, right? Which is a subtle difference. It doesn't mean that biological classification is entirely absent from the sources, because of course even texts such as the Shuo Wen Jie Zi include additional data beyond explaining the character. But have a look at this one here. This is one of my favorites, the Wu Ji Shu, right? Which is basically an explanation of the graph Shi here, right? The 5 skills squirrel, right? It's a squirrel that can fly, but it cannot fly over house roofs. It can climb, but can't reach the top of a tree. It can swim, but can't cross a gorge. It can dwell in a hole, but can't conceal its entire body. It can walk, but not in front or not faster than human beings, right? 不能现人. These are called its 5 skills. Now, it's impossible for us to trace the origins of the author's information, for the identification, of this particular Songshu, right? It's probably primarily based on texts, although we must assume that quite a number of Xu Shen's explanations are based on observation or hearsay. For instance, this 5 skills squirrel, Wu Ji Shu, occurs in the famous philosophical text, the Xunzi, but not in terms of its biological behavior, but instead to symbolize the idea of having many talents and not being able to bring any of them to perfection, right? So if somebody calls you a 5 skills squirrel, that's you're somebody with lots of potential, but you never really sort of bring everything, to completion. Now, it's important to note that the composition of the Shoen as a project and the inclusion of a large number of animal graphs were, of course, not driven by an intrinsic interest in analyzing animals, but by a desire to render an existing corpus of text, the Chinese classics, free of doubt. Right? That was the motivation behind the lexicography here. So Xu Shen is first and foremost concerned with the analysis of graphs representing the names of animals. And this is clear from those entries that define the basic animal graph classifiers. Now, few of those are followed by a statement on morphology, right? So this is what you've got. Yu, right, is defined as a shuichong, right, an aquatic animal. Niao is a collective noun for birds with a long tail. 长尾禽中鸣眼. Hu, the tiger, well, is the superior Shan Shou Zhi Jun, right? So this is an entirely different type of explanation. And the rat is a common noun for, crevice animals. Now, in many cases, the Shuan does not define the animal represented by the graph, but explains the pictographic semblance of the graph that represents the animal. So rather than stating that a yang, right, a goat or a sheep, is an animal with certain physical or behavioral characteristics, Xu Shen states that the graph yang, the horny type of graph here, represents the horn of a sheep. In other cases, animal graphs are defined by moral or cultural characteristics associated by the animal in question. And I give you a series of examples here. Like look at this definition for ma, right? Definition for ma is nu or wu. So it's a definition inspired by the horse's role in military affairs. I've never used so much energy in one lecture. Look at niu, right? Niu is explained as shi, to serve, or li, to offer, to order, and that basically is an explanation based on the ox, of course, as an animal used as a traction animal, right, in agriculture or in transportation. Hu, the fox, is qualified as sort of a prodigious animal on which demons take a ride. Sort of an entirely different explanation. And then, of course, Gui, the tortoise, is glossed as Zhou, right? Because, of course, the turtle, is old, right? Is meant to be old. It's meant to give you longevity. And of course, is also linked, of course, to divination. Now, there are other early Chinese texts where you see a mixture of biological and lexicographical criteria. This is usually limited to shape or habitat or color or size, and sometimes there's more detailed information. Now look at the Arya chapter on birds here, right? Here you have a tip on how you can differentiate the sex of birds, right? If you can't distinguish male from female birds, do it by means of the wings, the text says. Right, it's the one at the bottom here. very bottom. If the right wing covers over the left wing, then it's a male bird. And if the left wing covers over the right, then it's a female bird. Now, the majority of texts, however, focus on the recognition of animals and the association of the right name with the appropriate creature, rather than, the understanding of the biological properties of the animals themselves. And when Joseph Needham was discussing the role of names, of nomenclature in establishing of what he accepted to be a Chinese natural science, he argued that the Chinese preoccupation with nomenclature, with names, required, I quote him here, a scientific or at least proto-scientific tradition in which men were interested in debating exactly what it was that someone else was talking about, unquote. And this kind of self-consciousness concerning, names, Needham points out, was related to the Confucian doctrine of the rectification of names, Zhongming. So Needham sort of thought, well, this is all about Zhongming. Zhongming is a sort of a kind of a substitute for what you could conceive of as taxonomy. Now, Needham's link, of course, between a fascination with names, titles, and political philosophy is justified. There is no doubt about that. But his assumption that this preoccupation with names required a widespread proto-scientific debate, at least, with reference to animal nomenclature, that's unsubstantiated. It's questionable whether the examples I've given you from the shoreline for the fox, the horse, the ox, or the tortoise resulted from widely shared proto-scientific deliberation. These names are primarily the object of lexicographic deliberation. And of course, these definitions are written up in lexicographical text, which also happen to be composed, right, at the dawn of empire, right? Of course, Xushen, this is Han, but this is a time, of course, when scholars, wanted to represent the world as a whole through texts, right? There is a parallel here between the textual universe and the way in which people were conceiving, of the world at large, of the political world that they lived in. It's the biological empire, as if you like it, that is translated into texts. So it's linguistic authority, it's textual precedent that supersedes natural observation in determining the sort of outlines of the animal taxa here. Now, another way of classifying here is classifying through ritual, because the ritualist identified animals according to social criteria and divided the animal world within the overall structure of the ritualized state. So the second model that inspired the identification of animals here was their social and their ritual function. The ritualist classified animals according to social-religious criteria. And of course, since the single most important ritual context in ancient China was that of sacrifice, you'll find that animal classification often corresponds to establishing victimal hierarchies. In other words, you describe animals not simply by their biological features, but by the way in which they are suited for, used as victims in sacrifice. These hierarchies could be dictated by the status of the person who was allowed to sacrifice or the spirits that were addressed. And sacrificial criteria function as a kind of, I suppose, as a kind of classification of its own right. You have a few examples here on the slide, right? That first one from the Li Ji, from the Wang Zhi chapter, states that officers of different ranks are permitted to sacrifice oxen, and distinctions are made according to the physical appearance of the animal, right? So you have the Son of Heaven, who must use oxen of one color with a pure and unmixed hide, feudal prince sacrificed and fattened sacrificed a fattened ox, and a grandee was permitted to offer, the thin specimen amongst the pack. Then, according to another account, bull victims for the sacrifice of heaven, were fed over 5 years period until they reached a weight of nearly 700 kilos in hand times. And an alternative classification here is in the box here, the tino, right? Talk about a tino. It's a bull that you use for sacrificing, to heaven and earth. And that should have horns no longer than a cocoon or a chestnut. Whereas, a dino, right? This is an ox you use to sacrifice to the altar of the grain, right? Has horns that can be grasped by one hand. So, like they're a different size. So you see here, tino, gino, these become taxonomic kind of classification terms of their own. They're basically ritual ways of chopping up, of dividing, the animal world. And sometimes, of course, you can have multiple meanings associated, with species, right? You can have, for example, the goose. The goose, which is very often represented as an animal that represents rank and order and file, right? If you read Sun Tzu Pingfa, right, the goose formation in military text is a very common one, right? But at the same time, it's also the ideal wedding gift, because it is obedient and because it has orderly behavior, like in the Li Ji at least. So you have these multiple connotations attached to different animals. Another one, and that's one that I really like, is the use of sheng hao. These are victimal appellations. These are special names you give to animals when you use them in a ritual context. There are some examples here. For example, the pig, you call the pig a gang lie, stiff bristle, right? The sucking pig there, right? You call that one a tu fei, right? A fatling, right? And the young, a sheep, you call that one the rou mao, the soft hair. So you see, you have a whole set of terms that develop entirely in a sacrificial context. And most of these names find their origins in the desire that you want animals to be fat and glossy, right, when you sacrifice it, right? So when you have, the pheasant's called the shuzhi, right? The pheasant is called the bird whose toes are separated. That's a sign that it's fat, that it's really glossy. Right? So its toes are not standing right next to each other. And of course, the association of the chicken with it's called hanyin here, is something like the red call is based on its link, of course, with yang, with fire, with the south, and so on. So these are ritual classifications, entirely different from lexicographical classifications. Then we come, of course, to correlative classification, and this is a model here. Of course, I don't need to explain this to you. This is basically just a standardized model, yin-yang wuxing, which tries to find homologies between natural and human phenomena, right? And by assuming that the natural world is deeply implicated in human affairs, correlative models classified animals into a numerical series that serves to regulate human society by adjusting its workings to patterns in nature. And of course, this is the standard one, right? The standard classification, 5 different species, right? Lin, Yu, and then Luo, Mao, Jie, right? These are then corresponding, of course, to a season, to a color, and to a position, right? And then, of course, to one of the 5 faces. Now, this is the most frequent classification, and in most, there are variants of this. In most of them, human beings are the central class of naked animals, right? The inclusion of human beings within the framework of the 5-phase theory is an attempt to group humans along with other animal species within the same classificatory framework. Now, just as lexicographic and ritual classification is increasingly evident in sources datable to the early imperial period of political unification, the most comprehensive descriptions of animals and animal activity according to wuxing and yin-yang models develop, in Han times. So that's the early empire, basically. And I could give you plenty of examples. I've chosen a few from a text, known as the Huainanzi, right, which is a bit of a synthesizing text. The Western Han, compiled circa 140 BC, and it's got several schemes in it. It discusses classifications of animals across different chapters. In one passage, basically, and you have this one here, you have basically a chapter here that deals with astronomy, but it seeks to correlate animals and their locomotions, within a yin-yang paradigm, right? Certain animals are yang, certain animals are yin, and this is linked, to locomotion, even reproduction, and so on. In another chapter, dealing with topography, the Huainanzi divides and classifies animals according to their diet, for example. Right? So you have creatures that feed on water, on earth, on wood, on grass, on leaves, on flesh, on qi, and on grain. And spirits who are said to be immortal because they don't need to feed themselves, right? So their spirits are actually part of the whole taxonomy. Perhaps I'll show you one more here. Not to go into too much detail, but just so you get the idea here. You have a passage where you have the evolution of plants and animals in almost an evolutionary scheme in which there is a mythological ancestor who gives birth to 5 classes of animals via the intermediary of a dragon, right? You see there the Fei Long. So there seems to be all animals emerge from one, and each of the 5 animal classes, the Wuxing 5 animal classes, go through a dragon phase, almost as if there is a bit of a dragon, in each of us. I mean, these are all obviously examples in which, people are trying to sort of work with this Wuxing system, right? And of course, you can point out, well, what is the purpose and what is the value of these classification systems based on yin-yang and the 5 phases if they are not uniform, they are inconsistent, and sort of they have a lot of variations, right? So you'll find, for example, that the horse is commonly associated with yang, right, because of its martiality, its physical strength, but it's also found associated with yin, with the earth, and with the female, and with fertility. Amphibians are usually classified with scaly and fishy creatures, but, a text that we know from an excavation at Yinjueshan treats them as naked animals. So, in other words, we have these kind of variations. Okay. It's good we have a whole series here. Thank you. Now, we have all these variable systems here. The degree to which these classifications are consistent should not be the main criterion, in judging whether we are dealing with a relevant taxonomy, right? The central question here is whether correlative classifications were applied to the animal world out of an urge, to actually identify animals, or whether the animal world was just fitted into the system, into a theoretical framework of classification in order to illustrate, that yin-yang and 5-phase models apply to every aspect in the world. And actually, every single category of classification we have from the period never has more than 5 categories. It sits within that sort of Wuxing model, right? And that's, of course, the whole purpose of Wuxing. Wuxing is not a taxonomy, right? The whole purpose of Wuxing, it is a taxonomy, but it's a taxonomy that tries to demonstrate that everything can be related to everything else. And then actually you just apply the Wuxing model in order to define that relationship, to one another. It's one of the most tricky things always to explain, especially to, to students who study Chinese philosophy in the context of a Western university, when you talk about Wuxing or yin-yang, right? People sort of conceive of yin as a thing and yang as a thing, failing to forget that there are functions, right? Because, things can be yin if you're describing in certain functions, and they can be yang, of course, if you're describing in function of women are clearly yin when you're describing physical strength, but when we talk about the reproduction function, they're clearly yang. They are the most active partner. And so the same applies actually to taxonomies of the animal world. They're functional relationships. They're not trying to identify essential features of these creatures. And that's why an animal can be yin or yang, depending on what function you are describing. That's why your horse can be yang, but also yin. And so ultimately, there's only one person, who can understand and relate all of these phenomena together. And that's the Shongren. That's the sage ruler. That's the king. It's not the naturalist. In the eyes of the sage, the comprehension of the bigger picture of reality was more important than the call to scrutinize the individual elements of the natural world. And then finally, a word on moral classification, which is our fourth model, right? And this is, of course, a very prominent way in which the animal world was classified in early China. Namely, and we turn here to a few examples, which you find in several texts, but there's the insistence that the difference between animals and human beings is one of degree rather than kind, right? So what distinguishes human animals from non-human animals is morality rather than biology. Of course, you have the famous statement here in the Mengzi, right? 人之所以欲禽兽之几息, right? 庶民去之君之存之, right? So all of us are beasts. We can lapse into bestial behavior, right? Human beings can, and some human beings are probably in the warring states period behaving worse, than some animals would be. But this is sort of it's on a scale, Menzies says. And then it's only the gentleman, it's only the Junzi who manages to preserve that kind of moral difference between humans and animals, right? And of course, there are other examples. Famously in the Lunyu, right, that one passage where Confucius, is disappointed, when somebody criticizes him, saying, why are you refusing to turn your back on human society, right? Confucius would never do that. And he says, well, I cannot. He says, 鸟兽不可与同群, right? I cannot flock together with birds and beasts. So am I not a member of this human species? With whom then can I associate myself? Question. So, although Confucius dissociates himself from the birds and the beasts by indicating that he would only associate with morally superior members of the human species, he implies, again, that the divide between humans and the bestial does not run parallel with the biological distinction between animals and human beings. And then here I give you a passage from the Xunzi, which tends to be quoted a great deal, because it is one of the few passages, which, in a way, Western philosophers saw, could connect potentially, with something that they saw, sort of in Greek philosophy. This is the famous ladder of souls passage, right? And this is a term that Joseph Needham used to refer to this passage, right? Where Xunzi says, water and fire have qi, but not sheng, right? Herbs have sheng, but no knowledge. Animals have zhi, but no yi. Human beings have qi, have sheng, have zhi, but also have yi, right? And therefore they are the most valuable, in the world. So according to Xunzi, humans distinguish themselves from the biological and cognitive condition of non-humans by a moral sense for righteousness. And there is plenty of material in the text of the time, that could all slot under, this sort of rubric of moral classification, of animals. Now, I'd like to sort of draw things, to a conclusion here, and just sort of, rehearse a little bit what we've seen so far in our story. That's, first of all, that it is very common for anybody who conceptualizes the animal world, that one does so by reference to the human world, right? I mean, it's ironic, I think one of the reasons that animal studies has become a discipline in the last 15 years, right? And 30 years ago, nobody wrote about animals in China, or there were lots of articles about the dragon, but that was about it, right? One of the reasons that it is, of course, such a such a vibrant kind of field is because, of course, it's all related to the human domain, right? The more we write about animals, the more we're trying to say something about us, right? And in a way, you know, that's something which, if you read Montaigne, for example, right? Montaigne already saw this, right? And he noticed this, right? He says every species, right, reduces the qualities of everything else to analogies with its own, right? So we analogize when we try to define species, right? Now this observation, of course, can, as anthropologists have confirmed in contemporary societies, it can lead either to sociocentric models, in other words, when categories and relations are used as a kind of mental template for ordering the world, or to a dualistic universe, right? As in the case of Western cosmologies, where nature is defined as that ordered part of reality that exists independently from human action. Now, every culture classifies and differentiates its surrounding reality. You know, it's just part of us. We all want to somehow classify and explain. So in a way, you could argue that even the absence of classification should be considered a classificatory statement, you see. I mean, even an absence is actually a statement on classification. It's clear that there are a number of basic principles regarding classification that apply in early Chinese classifications of animal data. First, there is a concern, right, for any tradition to classify living kinds either culturally or scientifically, to collect morphological data into basic level categories or taxa. I mean, that's what our texts do, right? You may use wings, or you may use color, or you may use diet. All of these are taxa. These are units for classification. And secondly, it's an important assumption underlying this deductive process that one seeks for patterns of similarity or homogeneity. That is, an observer seeks to rank individual morphological data according to their greatest probability or likeness or difference. And finally, classification involves varying degrees of abstraction of biological reality, and as a consequence, generic typicality is made to prevail over individual specificity. Now, what then do attitudes towards animals tell us about the ways in which the early Chinese conceived of classification? First, they suggest that classification through integration and correlation were more important than classifying by differentiation. Right? So rather than classify the whole as a collection of parts, classification is seen as establishing a comprehensive whole, right? Encompassing all parts. Now, in principle, this orientation would lean itself well to biological abstraction. However, and that's secondly, sources suggest only a faint interest in biological observation. The interest in the biological explanation of the animal world is conditioned by the degree in which biology can be made subject to the explanation of the world that needs to be represented as a textual, ritual, and hence a moral order. And finally, through various modes of classifying the animal world, empiricism clearly remains secondary to the desire for totality or comprehensiveness in classification. And so we need to get back to the metaphor I started with today. The dragon, right? Because once you define the dragon, it ceases to be a dragon, and it loses its power, and it loses its mystery. That's why it's a hybrid. That's why it's a shapeshifter. And look who's here. Even Juanito, right, 20th century, continues the search, right? I'm just giving you an extract here from a piece he wrote, right? What is this dragon? Well, it resembles a horse. That's why sometimes a horse is also called a long, right? But the dragon also resembles a dog, longxianggao, right? And that's why a dog is sometimes called a dragon. In addition, there's also a kind of dragon with scales resembling fish, a kind with wings resembling a bird, a kind with horns resembling a deer, right? When we come to the various kinds of crawling creatures most easily confused with the dragon, right? What did he say? Right? So we don't even need to be mentioning them, right? So at the end of the day, Juanito's description of the dragon is exactly the same, as the one, that we started with, in early China. And it is that sort of notion of shifting boundaries, perceptions, and change, I think, that helps us, get a little bit closer to the way in which the ancient Chinese comprehended the animal world. 谢谢。
好，在那个自然史跟那个动物史的研究当中，这个定义跟分类向来是一个非常重要的问题。啊，我记得那个米歇尔·福寇在他的名著《The Order of Things》词与物这本书里面，一开始就引了那个 Louis Borges 提到，就是说中国古代有一个很奇特的关于这种物类的这种分类的方式。那过去那个科学史家像那个 Benjamin Ehrman，他也特别针对那个明代的李时珍的《本草纲目》跟那个就是当时的一些流行的类书呢，去就是讨论当中的这个分类的问题，因为分类涉及到我们怎么去界定一些知识的框架以及它内在的一些理路。那今天那个胡教授的演讲呢？我觉得又再度打开就是这个我们的视野，把这个物类的分类呢，放在就是说图像方面，仪式方面，还有这种就是说阴阳五行对应的思考脉络，然后最后还有这种道德的层次，我觉得就是说可以让这种动物史或是自然史或是博物方面的研究呢，未来可以有更多的可能性。那我们现在还有一些时间呢，我们开放现场的观众提问因为那个刚才胡教授已经提到，他当年是在台大学中文，他其实汉语能力很好，所以你们可以选择你们自己喜欢的语言发问那我们开放，那提问的时候麻烦自我介绍一下，这样Okay, please.
Hello, I study great talk. Thank you so much for that. And I come from Austria. I study in the master's program here at NCCU Asian Studies. I don't have I guess my question is in some ways a dragon because it's not strictly defined yet. Perhaps. I just wonder when you mention morality and the definition and how these conceptualizations relate to power in a Foucauldian sense also, like in terms of the order of things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question because, in a way, I mean, look the sources that we have. Take as an example, the Shouwenjizi, right? These are lexicographies, right? Most of these texts, like in late imperial China, where you have the sort of encyclopedias or the Leishu, right? These are, of course, all texts that somehow are commissioned by or organized as an editorial project, through the center, right, through the court, right. 本草纲目 is the same. I mean, 本草纲目 is commissioned by the court, of course. Why? Of course, because this is what empires do, right? This is what people who are, claiming, political authority want to do. You want to show you grasp the world by, organizing all the knowledge about the world, right? It's only the British Empire could have organized the Oxford Dictionary of the English language, right? I mean, you need to have an empire before you can even claim, to put together, sort of a dictionary of a muyu. But yes, and so of course, this is what happens in these texts as well. Now, we are limited in the sense that these are our main sources, right? It's changing gradually, and I'm not a specialist at all, in zoo archaeology, but zoo archaeology is a discipline that in the last 15, 20 years really is coming on in China, that people are actually looking at bones, which tell us much more in a way than our lexicographers do. But then, of course, people would still refer to dragon bones, right? I mean, the Jaguan were known as dragon bones, right, when they were discovered. And so there is an intimate link between claim to political authority and claim to power and the classification of animals in the world at large. And that's why it's only the sage, ultimately, that seems to be capable of doing it, of classifying the world. You do find now and then alternative models. I mean, we don't have much, but we have some medical texts, some medical manuscripts, or manuscripts rather of medical texts, from the period, from which you can derive a lot of information, where you see classifications of animals and plants based on their medical use, for example. But they will always then also claim some kind of link to a canon, and canonization by definition means, of course, a central authority, a political or other that underlies it. And that's maybe, I suppose, what's really interesting in this context too is that if you think about the figure of Kongzi, right, Confucius, right, he has almost nothing to say about birds and beasts, but he says one important thing: if you want to learn about birds and beasts, you must read the Shi Jing, 要读诗经, right? Because the Shi Jing, the book of odes, is the treasure trove for that sort of information. Where he was not appealing to knowledge of birds and beasts, but he was appealing to, of course, the importance of the Shi Jing, as a classic. So it's political authority, but also textual authority, and we should never forget that. It's actually astonishing if you look at the Leishu, if you look at the text if you look at 本草纲目, for example, right? A lot of the information in these texts is simply, is textual information that you can trace back, sometimes, as far as the Han Dynasty, right? Does that mean, that people's understanding of the natural world in the Ming period, in Li Shizhen's time, hadn't evolved or is still the same? No, probably not. But that was not the point. The point was that he was going to text mine tradition in order to, organize all plants and animals and rocks and minerals of the world in a new way, suitable, for his time and his period. But thank you. It's very, very good question.
请问还有吗？大家把握时间。好。
Hello, I'm here right now with Roel Sterckx scholarship. I'm a PhD student, a second-year PhD student, and I study Chinese studies and philosophy and politics as well. My question was mainly about one of the philosophical remarks that you made earlier in your presentation when you quoted André, I don't know how to pronounce his surname because I don't speak French, but
Malraux.
Yeah, exactly. You quoted him and you talked about how in the Chinese thought the subject and the object merge in a way, so that, for example, the painter of a cat becomes one with the cat. But in the West, we usually use those maybe Plato's forms that we talk about this catness, and we see a picture of this cat. So I just wanted you to maybe, if possible, to elaborate on it a little bit more, because I deal with a kind of similar topic or similar thought. So I would like to hear more about particularly the way of the subject and the object merging in your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. Malraux's two interlocutors, both Ling and his traveler who's in China at the time, they're of course both Malraux, right? So it's basically Malraux talking to himself, right? And so he makes that distinction, right, between subject and object. So I use that passage, merely as a prompt, as an umbrella to get into my materials. I suppose people who study aesthetics and people who study, painting, right, will be able to give you a much more sophisticated sort of rundown of the general idea. But, we have to be very careful, even, and maybe I've not been careful enough by simply saying, well, the cat from Malraux, that really suits my purposes in order to, as a hook, right? But of course, it is, in many ways, it's a truism. It's sometimes a stereotype, right, in presentations of early Chinese thought. That somehow, whatever, the Chinese didn't make a distinction between subject and object, right? And look at the Greeks, they objectify the world, and then you still have to specify which, who among the Greeks. Now, in a way, these are very simplified categorizations. I mean, like, it is inconceivable that people in ancient China didn't think about people as subject, as individuals, right, and as objects in the world out there. I mean, it's a difference of emphasis rather than a difference, of orientation, right? And I think an example of where you can see, a different type of emphasis, if we stick with illustration, is, for example, if we look at naturalist illustrations, if we look at illustrations of animals and plants in the Chinese tradition, and well, we need to go back to Pen Cao Gang, we need to go back to that, to the earliest kind of Lei Shu that also have printed illustrations in there. And you'll see that lots of these illustrations are very generic. You can't see what's happening in the illustration unless you have the text right next to you, right? And you have a description of 3 different categories of worm, and the illustrations are nearly the same. It's as if the illustrations are just stuck in there, either, of course, to embellish the text in the age of print, which is important, or that they're not really important, right? So that, whereas if you compare those illustrations, of course, with contemporaries in Europe, right, academia, the Linche, for example, you see these illustrations, of the anatomy, of animals that are very, very detailed, in great contours, right? And so it's almost suggesting that, rather than subject versus object, that it's actually saying, well, look, it's the representation of something in a text that you can link to the past, that gives authority to your explanation, rather than the way in which you illustrate a particular kind of animal, or rock or object. I don't have a horse in this race about subject versus object in Chinese philosophy, although I have been taken to task by scholars like Ed Slingerland for maybe overemphasizing it. I suppose to claim that, you know, the distinction between, you know, between subject or an object is not. I suppose that the point to make is that it's a difference in degree, rather than, you know, than in essence. And you know, one has to be a little bit careful with this, right? Because historians of science then take it one step further, and they see, well, the reason that, of course, quote unquote science, right, or the biological sciences didn't develop in China is because, of course, you know, if the subject can't step out of its object, you know, like you'll never have a lab, and you'll never have experiment. And in order to experiment, you need competition. And in order to have competition, you can't have competition because, you know, like the confusion, you know, sort of context in which people operate prevent that sort of experimental competition. I think that's the more important way of looking at it rather than just doing it through philosophy. But yeah, so for me, Malraux is a hook. And I like the passage because it does emphasize movement, change, rather than fixity and trying to sort of pinpoint and define everything.
还有吗？啊，请。
侯教授你好，我也研究一些跟宗教与环境有关的议题。那我想请教的是，从宗教上面来定义或分类动物，包括万物有灵 animism 的角度，every animals or even stones or trees they have spirits inside them。如果是从这个角度跟从文本上，所以宗教大部分是 bottom up by the lay people, not by intellectuals. So they consider or perceive the world in different way. So how do you think about that? And considering about religions, after Buddhism imported in mainland China, everything changed because people can transform into different living creatures because of your moralities and because of the karma or reincarnation. Any living creatures can transform into different forms in different lives. So how do you think about religions? Thank you.
谢谢你的问题我理解您所提的问题很有道理，但是问题就是什么叫宗教？对于我来说，在古代中国的时候，宗教实际上是祭祀文化，最重要就是祭祀文化。然后animism 或者 shamanism is a very tricky category, and the other one 图腾主义 right? Totemism, which is another one which many scholars still in mainland China tend to use. I think it's valuable, to use the religious context. What I would say is that the idea that creatures can change into other creatures, clearly was there before Buddhism came into China. And maybe, Buddhism could actually feed off an indigenous tradition. I mean, there's almost a contingent tradition of what later becomes the Gui Guai, tradition, where people change into other. So, for me, in the period in which I'm familiar with, it really is, sacrificial culture and everything that surrounds it. Rather than things like belief. I mean, you can't measure, I think most of the data we have about early Chinese religion deals with the materiality of religion. With the sort of almost the 物质性, with how do you offer things? You know, like how much does it cost? How do you bury people? How much can you spend on funerals? That's a massive discussion. And I think, you know, that's much more fruitful, you know, to look into the way in which people conceived of the non-human world in a religious context. Of course, there are multiple beliefs associated, you know, with certain animals, and of course, you can go back to the Jagu one, right, and look at the turtle shell, and look at the turtle shell as a representation of the cosmos, right, sort of round on the top and square at the bottom, but ultimately, I think most people would conceive of the world around them probably by the way they do religion, you know, to quote one of my colleagues, Adam Zhao, you know, in Cambridge, rather than by what it is they were believing in. And I think we have much more information about how people did religion than what their religious universe looked like.
So just a quick question. To what degree would you talk about, or can we analyze, say, the knowledge about animal in early China? I'm asking because you mentioned this famous passage from the 论语, where Confucius is advising that reading 诗经 could 多知鸟兽之名. Right? So it looks as if one knows about the name of those creatures, one seems to understand the nature of these things. Can we make such an inference, or I mean, would that be counted as kind of knowing animal in early China? I'm just wondering how would you think about this issue? Thank you.
I think his comment is not about knowing animals. I think it's about studying the Shi Jing. Ultimately, right? You also have to, in any culture, right? The names of plants and the names of animals, right, are the most complex, you know, universe to understand, right? I mean, you can already, as soon as the 3rd century AD, we already have lexicons. You know, we have, you know, texts like the Fangyan, where you describe dialects, right? Where you have different names for different animals in different parts, you know, of what is then, you know, the Chinese Empire, right? Where they will say, well, look, in the state of Qi, right, Shandong 那边, right, a 蝙蝠, a bat, is called a 仙鼠, an immortal rat, right? Because back there, people call it a 仙鼠 because the state of Qi was associated with immortality, and so it's not necessarily a uniquely Chinese feature that people trying to sort out the names by which we name the animal world. Actually, you know, there are multiple taxonomies, you know, of animals all the way up to the present day, right? The question is, what is there besides? And maybe to link your question to the previous question here, right? So it's very interesting, right, that we have almost no records in early China of, you know, experimental dissections, right, or autopsies of human beings or of animals. I mean, there's the one famous one where they do an autopsy of a criminal, you know, in the hand by using a bamboo tube and going through his vein. But there's nothing. There was no divination by means of entrails like the Romans did, right? The Greeks did. But sacrifice. If you look at the ritual canon, it's one of the few places where you have a descriptions of the organs of various animals, apart from the medical canon, you know, where you use them as medicine. So, for example, you know, in the Sanli, you have descriptions of, for example, the lungs. Why are the lungs important? Because they have a lot of xue, and that's why you put them in front of the sacrificial altar, because they're the most important ones. So it's quite interesting that it's actually the sacrificial context that gives you almost sort of, that gets you insight, you know, like the bodies of animals. And it's not you know, the scholar who is experimenting, you know, in his back garden, you know, sort of whatever, you know, like cutting open his own sheep or something, or dissecting a fish. I'm sure people did this, but there's no evidence. There is no shortage of evidence. I mean, the Greeks started dissecting bodies after battle. Well, the warring state, 战国时代, right, was not short of battles and victims. There are plenty of dead bodies, you know, like to experiment on, right? But there is no, you know, record that was done extensively. And so it's then, you know, you have a universe of names, of text, and calling a dog basically, right? In order to, you know, to sort of convey knowledge. But we don't have that other universe, that universe of kind of, you know, experimental curiosity. It's not that it's not there, there are snippets of it. But, you know, if you look at the 汉书译文志 catalog, right, of the Imperial Library by the end of Western Han, I mean, the texts that proclaim themselves to be dealing with animals, I mean, it's like a handful. It's a handful. There's almost nothing there, you know, in the imperial biography. And so we must assume that the absence of evidence is not always the same as evidence of absence. But clearly there was no canon there where people wrote about animals. And next week, when I talk about agriculture, I will try and point out a very interesting parallel, because the same applies, you know, to agriculture in ancient China.
请问有没有最后一个问题？有吗？好。
Thank you for a very wonderful lecture. And I'm wondering, at the beginning of your lecture, you quote Jean de Groot, the religious. Yeah. Sorry, I cannot pronounce his name.
It's very difficult. It's Dutch.
The religious system of China. He stated that the Chinese author has conveyed that there is no distinction between human and animal, but we all know that in Confucius' idea, like Confucian monks and Xunzi, they always emphasize the difference between human and animal, especially on moral. So I'm wondering why this book states that. Yeah, thank you.
It's a very good question. Yeah, and de Groot, right? Well, he was looking for, I suppose, Aristotle, right? He was looking for for kind of biological distinctions, descriptions of biological distinctions between animals and humans. And he was also probably overemphasizing, you know, this lack of a difference, because he was very interested, of course, in religious lore, in stories of transformation, you know, human-animal transformations. And so it's probably a combination of both. Because, of course, you could make the argument in two ways, right? You could say, look, Confucius and Confucian thought is human-centered, right? 以人为本, right? You know, all these kind of standards in Chinese philosophy, right? So, and therefore, right, because, you know, like most of Confucian thought is focused on human society, right? On Friday, I will show you how it's used now to focus on the environment, right? But that basically, that's why, you know, like, why study the animal world? You know, if you don't understand human behavior properly yet, right? Why study spirits, you know, if you don't know how to, you know, how to understand this life? That's one way of saying it. But quite clearly what these Han Xuejia were looking for were sort of traces of people who were actually almost like trying to distinguish humans from animals based on their morphology, whether or not they have, a soul, right? Hun, Po, all these these were questions that came out of, I suppose, out of European theology. They came out of questions that were very prominent in Europe. And they didn't see that in the texts, they were familiar with. And that's probably why they made these kind of comments. So when we say, well, when de Groot says, well, they have completely, refused or turned their back towards trying to describe the distinction between humans and animals, he was probably saying, well, nobody's written a treatise, right, that does an analysis between, the difference between human beings and animals. But at the same time, of course, like you have all these texts, you have the whole Confucian tradition that doesn't talk about it. And by not talking about it, it doesn't mean that you don't conceive of differences. It just means that it is not an object or topic of intellectual inquiry. And one thing when we compare, because I've done a few comparative comments, like I've given you a few comparisons in this lecture. One of something I've learned really, and learned the hard way, because you make so many mistakes going along. When you try and make comparisons between different cultures, right? It is much better to focus on the questions that people ask in different cultures, rather than the answers that they give to individual questions, because the answers will be different. And the answers will be different based on circumstances, historical contexts, and the actors involved. But the questions are important, right? And, if our Chinese philosophers don't come up with with the question, like, what is an animal? Then that may be significant, right? The fact that the question is not there is interesting, right? It doesn't mean that they don't conceive of animals as different of human beings in daily life. But it just means that, well, for some reason, that was a question which was not thought of as problematic, as something that requires, critical reflection. And so that really is the most valuable thing when you try and compare and contrast, is focus on the questions different cultures and different civilizations ask, because we can debate the answers, like ad nauseum as long as we want. But if the question is very prominent in one particular context and absent in another one, well, that's a significant, I suppose, prompt to start thinking.
好，经过2小时的演讲，我想胡教授很累，因为他前2天才到，现在还有时差。但如果在座朋友或线上朋友，大家还有兴趣，星期五同一个时间，好10点到12点，他要接着讲，就是中国古代的人如何思考或观察环境的问题。这个环境史、环境研究现在也是非常非常热门的。我有个朋友在韩国，他们甚至成立了一个环境与身体的研究所。这是一个非常新的议题。那我们期待，就是说，中国古代如何跟现代进行更深度的对话。那我们最后以热烈掌声，谢谢胡司德教授今天的精彩演讲。好，谢谢。